October 15th, 2019. A renowned historian stood before Boston's elite at the Whitmore estate, smirking as he challenged the room. Who here can actually speak Latin, the language of scholars and intellectuals? When the maid's teenage daughter quietly raised her hand from the corner, his condescending laugh echoed through the silence, but what happened next would expose a secret that shattered everything he thought he knew about intelligence and privilege. Could a girl from the shadows really humiliate one of America's most celebrated academics in front of high society? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The crystal chandeliers of the Whitmore estate cast prismatic shadows across marble floors that had witnessed 3 generations of Boston's most influential gatherings. Tonight was no different. October's chill had driven the city's elite indoors, where they clustered in small groups, champagne flutes catching the light as they discussed art acquisitions, political donations, and whose children had been accepted to which Ivy League institutions. Margaret Chen moved through these crowds like a ghost, her arms laden with silver trays of canapes that cost more than her mother's monthly salary. At 16, she had perfected the art of invisibility, eyes down, movements efficient, presence forgettable. The guests barely registered her existence as she wove between their designer suits and silk gowns. Just another piece of the carefully orchestrated evening that Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore had spent 3 months planning. Her mother, Rosa Chen, worked in the kitchen alongside 5 other staff members, orchestrating the evening's culinary performance with military precision. Rosa had been the Whitmore family's head housekeeper for 12 years, a position she'd earned through relentless dedication and an uncanny ability to anticipate needs before they were voiced. Margaret had grown up in the margins of this world, doing homework in staff quarters, reading books borrowed from the estate's extensive library when no one was looking, existing in the peculiar limbo between 2 Americas that would never quite touch. Tonight's event was special, according to the whispered conversations Margaret had overheard while polishing silver earlier that week. Dr. Jonathan Hartwick, the celebrated historian from Harvard, whose recent book about Roman civilization had topped the New York Times bestseller list for 14 weeks, would be giving an informal talk in the Whitmore's Grand Salon. The guest list read like a who's who of Boston society: philanthropists, museum curators, technology entrepreneurs who'd made their fortunes and now sought the patina of culture that old money possessed instinctively. Margaret had seen Dr. Hartwick arrive 2 hours earlier, his entrance commanding immediate attention. He was a tall man in his late 50s, with silver hair swept back from a patrician face and the kind of confidence that came from decades of academic accolades and social validation. He'd handed his coat to Margaret without looking at her, already engaged in animated conversation with a woman wearing what had to be a genuine Chanel suit. Now, as the dinner plates were cleared and guests migrated toward the salon, Margaret found herself stationed near the doorway, tasked with offering after-dinner cordials from a tray of cut crystal glasses. The salon itself was a masterpiece of old-world elegance. Walls lined with first-edition books, Persian rugs worth more than most houses, and oil paintings whose subjects seemed to judge the living with aristocratic disdain. Dr. Hartwick positioned himself before the marble fireplace, a natural stage that elevated him slightly above his audience. The conversations gradually faded as people settled into leather chairs and antique settees, attention gravitating toward the evening's main attraction. Margaret remained near the back wall, tray balanced perfectly, body angled to be available without being intrusive. "Thank you all for indulging an old professor's passion this evening," Dr. Hartwick began, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone accustomed to lecture halls. "When Eleanor invited me to speak about my recent work on Roman political philosophy, I have to admit I was delighted. It's rare to find an audience that appreciates the relevance of ancient wisdom to our modern challenges." Polite laughter rippled through the room. Margaret watched as he warmed to his subject, discussing Cicero's rhetoric, Caesar's strategic genius, and the collapse of republican ideals under imperial ambition. He was undeniably brilliant, weaving historical anecdotes with contemporary parallels, making dead emperors feel relevant to people worried about stock, portfolios, and social media algorithms. But there was something else in his delivery too, a subtle condescension that Margaret recognized from years of observation. The way he paused for laughter at jokes that reinforced his audience's sense of their own sophistication, the casual name-dropping of his Oxford colleagues, and his summers spent excavating sites in Italy. The unspoken message that he was generously sharing knowledge with people who, while wealthy, could never quite match his intellectual pedigree. Of course, he said, gesturing broadly, we must remember that Latin itself was the language of power, of law, of the church. To control Latin was to control knowledge itself. The masses remained illiterate, dependent on those educated few who could decode the texts that governed their lives. Margaret's fingers tightened imperceptibly on her tray. She'd spent 3 years teaching herself Latin from books she'd discovered in the Whitmore Library's less-traveled corners. What had started as curiosity, a desire to understand the mysterious phrases inscribed on monuments and embedded in English words, had become an obsession. She'd worked through grammar texts during her lunch breaks, practiced conjugations while folding laundry, translated passages of Virgil and Ovid late into the night by flashlight in the small apartment she shared with her mother. Not for any practical purpose, not for college applications or career advancement. Those felt like distant dreams for a girl whose guidance counselor had suggested she consider realistic options like cosmetology school. She'd learned Latin for the same reason she read poetry and studied astronomy from library books, because some part of her refused to accept that her world should be limited to the margins where she'd been born. The beauty of Latin, Dr. Hartwig continued, his tone taking on a more theatrical quality, is that it remains pure, uncorrupted by the democratic impulse that has diluted so much of modern education. It requires discipline, rigor, a certain intellectual capacity that, let's be honest, not everyone possesses. Several guests nodded approvingly. Margaret noticed Mrs. Patricia Ashford, a museum trustee known for her opinions on maintaining standards, smiling with particular satisfaction. Dr. Hartwig's eyes swept across the room, and Margaret saw something shift in his expression, a calculated decision to make his point more dramatically. He smiled, the gesture not quite reaching his eyes. In fact, he said, his voice rising slightly with challenge, I'd wager that genuine Latin fluency has become so rare in our modern age that... He paused for effect, letting the moment stretch. Who here can actually speak Latin, not recognize a few phrases, or remember verb conjugations from high school? I mean truly speak it, converse in it, think in it the way the Romans did. The silence that followed was expectant, almost amused. A few guests exchanged glances, perhaps remembering distant classroom struggles with amo, amas, amat. Someone laughed softly, acknowledging the rhetorical nature of the question. Dr. Hartwig's smile widened, vindication written across his features. You see, even among the most educated, most cultured gathering one could hope to. Margaret's hand rose. It happened almost involuntarily, some deep instinct overriding years of careful invisibility. Her arm lifted from her side, steady and certain, the tray of cordials balanced perfectly in her other hand. The movement caught Dr. Hartwig's attention mid-sentence. His eyes fixed on her, confusion flickering across his face as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. A server, a girl, brown-skinned, slight, wearing the black uniform that marked her as help rather than guest. The room's attention followed his gaze. 70 people turned as one, conversations dying in mid-breath. Margaret stood there, hand raised like a student volunteering an answer, and felt the weight of every eye in the room. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hand didn't waver. Dr. Hartwick's expression transformed, confusion giving way to something that looked uncomfortably like contempt. His lips curved into a smile that was really a sneer, the kind of expression that announced a joke before it was told. "I'm sorry," he said, voice dripping with false solicitude. "Did you need to be excused to attend to something in the kitchen?" A few guests laughed, nervous, uncertain, but laugh they did. Margaret lowered her tray carefully to a nearby side table. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but clear, each word precisely enunciated. "No, sir. You asked who here speaks Latin. I do." The silence that followed was absolute. Dr. Hartwick's laugh broke the silence, sharp, dismissive, designed to restore the natural order that Margaret's words had momentarily disrupted. It was the kind of laugh that invited others to join in, to collectively acknowledge the absurdity of what they'd just heard. "That's charming," he said, his tone making it clear that charming was the last thing he found. "Tell me, did you pick up a few phrases from one of Mrs. Whitmore's books? Carpe diem, perhaps?" "Veni, vici!" Several guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, seated in the front row, had gone rigid, her face a mask of barely controlled mortification. This was not part of her carefully orchestrated evening. Staff did not speak unless spoken to directly. They certainly did not interrupt distinguished speakers in front of Boston's most prominent citizens. Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she held her ground. She'd already crossed the invisible line that separated her world from theirs. There was no retreating now without making things worse. "No, sir," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "I've studied Latin for 3 years. Grammar, syntax, classical texts. I can read Virgil, Cicero, Ovid. I can translate and I can speak it." The claim hung in the air like something physical. A few guests exchanged glances. Was this girl serious? Was this some kind of performance art that Mrs. Whitmore had arranged? But Eleanor's expression made it clear this was no planned entertainment. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dr. Hartwick's smile had frozen into something harder. His eyes narrowed as he reassessed the situation, calculating how to handle this unexpected challenge to his authority. He'd spent 40 years in academia, published 7 books, delivered lectures in 17 countries. He was not about to be contradicted by a teenage server in front of an audience that had paid significant social capital to be here. "Is that so?" he said, his voice taking on a pedagogical edge, the tone of a professor about to expose a student's ignorance. "Well then, perhaps you can tell us all, what is the ablative absolute construction, and how does it function in Latin syntax?" It was a test designed to humiliate, to reveal the gap between Margaret's presumption and actual knowledge. The ablative absolute was a notoriously tricky grammatical structure that confused even advanced Latin students. Margaret didn't hesitate. The ablative absolute is a grammatical construction consisting of a noun and a participle, both in the ablative case, that provides circumstantial information independent of the main clause. It typically expresses time, cause, or condition. For example, Caesar douche means with Caesar as leader, or Caesar being leader. The answer was precise, accurate, delivered with the confidence of genuine understanding. Dr. Hartwick's expression flickered, surprise, quickly masked by renewed condescension. "Anyone can memorize a definition," he said dismissively. "Latin is not an academic exercise. It's a living intellectual tradition. It requires cultural context, historical understanding, the ability to grasp nuance that comes only from years of dedicated study under proper guidance." He turned back to his audience, ready to continue his lecture and relegate Margaret back to irrelevance. But something in his dismissal ignited a spark of defiance that Margaret hadn't known she possessed. "Then test me," she said. The words came out louder than she'd intended, cutting through the murmured conversations that had started to resume. Dr. Hartwick turned back to her, his face now showing genuine anger beneath the professional veneer. "Excuse me? Test me," Margaret repeated, her voice calmer now, but no less firm. "You said I've only memorized definitions, so test me. Ask me anything about Latin grammar, literature, history, or better yet, speak to me in Latin. If it's truly a living language, as you say, we should be able to converse in it, shouldn't we?" A collective intake of breath swept through the salon. This had gone from awkward to spectacular. Several guests leaned forward, invested now in a drama that was far more compelling than any lecture on Roman philosophy. Mrs. Whitmore stood abruptly, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Margaret, that is quite enough. You will return to the kitchen immediately and—" "No, no, Eleanor," Dr. Hartwig interrupted, raising a hand with false magnanimity. His eyes remained fixed on Margaret, and there was something predatory in his gaze now. "The girl wants to be tested. Who am I to deny such enthusiasm for learning?" He stepped down from his position by the fireplace, moving closer to Margaret with the deliberate pace of someone establishing dominance. When he spoke, his voice was loud enough for everyone to hear, each word carefully enunciated. "Very well. Translate this. Quo usque tandem abutere Catilina, patientia nostra." It was the famous opening line from Cicero's first Catiline oration, a text that any serious Latin student would recognize. But Dr. Hartwig was counting on Margaret not being a serious student, just a girl with delusions of education who'd memorized a few facts. Margaret met his eyes directly for the first time. "How long, Catiline, will you abuse our patience?" It's from Cicero's speech against Catiline's conspiracy. He delivered it in the Senate in 63 BCE, accusing Catiline of plotting to overthrow the Republic. The full opening passage continues. "How long will that madness of yours mock us? To what end will your unbridled audacity hurl itself?" She saw the flicker of surprise in Dr. Hartwig's eyes before he could suppress it. Several guests were now openly interested, their phones forgotten, their attention completely captured by this impossible confrontation. "Anyone can recognize Cicero," Dr. Hartwig said, but there was less certainty in his voice now. "Let's try something more obscure. Translate, arma virumque cano, Troiae qui primus ab oris Italiam fato profugus, Laviniaque venit litora." The opening lines of Virgil's Aeneid. Margaret spoke without hesitation. "I sing of arms, and the man who, exiled by fate, first came from the shores of Troy to Italy and the Lavinian shores. It's the beginning of Virgil's epic, establishing Aeneas as the founder of what would become Rome. The entire poem is about destiny, duty, and the costs of empire." Dr. Hartwig's jaw tightened. The room had gone completely silent again, but the quality of the silence had changed. People were no longer waiting for Margaret to be dismissed. They were waiting to see what would happen next. "Fine," he said, his voice harder now, stripped of its earlier theatrical charm. "You've memorized some famous passages. That's commendable for someone of your background. But Latin is more than recitation. It requires analytical thinking, the ability to engage with complex philosophical concepts. Tell me, what is the central paradox in Lucretius's De Rerum Natura, and how does he attempt to resolve it?" It was a question designed for graduate students, not teenage girls working as servers. Lucretius's great poem, On the Nature of Things, was a philosophical text that explored Epicurean atomism and the nature of reality. Dense, challenging, requiring not just translation, but deep comprehension. Margaret took a breath. She'd discovered Lucretius 2 years ago, had spent months working through his hexameter verses during breaks between serving meals and cleaning bathrooms. The philosophy had fascinated her, the idea that the universe operated by natural laws rather than divine whim, that understanding nature could free humans from fear. Lucretius faces the paradox of trying to write poetry about a philosophy that claims the highest good is absence of pain and disturbance. She began, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "Poetry is passionate, emotional, ambitious, everything Epicureanism supposedly rejects. But Lucretius argues that understanding the true nature of things, that atoms move in void, that there are no angry gods to fear, that death is simply dissolution, this knowledge itself brings peace. His poetry isn't a contradiction of his philosophy. It's the vehicle for delivering that liberating truth to those who wouldn't otherwise engage with pure philosophy. The salon was absolutely still. Margaret could see several guests staring at her with expressions that ranged from shock to something that might have been respect. Mrs. Patricia Ashford, the museum trustee who'd smiled at Dr. Hartwick's earlier elitism, had her hand over her mouth. Dr. Hartwick's face had gone from ruddy to pale. His fingers clenched and unclenched at his sides. This wasn't supposed to happen. Girls like this didn't possess this kind of knowledge. The natural order of things, education, class, access, it all dictated that she should have failed spectacularly by now. Lucky guess, he said, but his voice had lost its authority. Or perhaps you've been coached. Someone must have "Loquer Latin," Margaret said quietly. Speak Latin, Dr. Hartwick blinked. What? Loquer Latin, Margaret repeated louder now. You said Latin is a living language. That it requires the ability to think in it, to use it naturally. So speak to me in Latin, not recited passages. Actual conversation. Prove that you can do what you claim makes someone truly educated. And in that moment, as Dr. Jonathan Hartwick stood before Boston's elite with a teenage girl, challenging him to demonstrate the very expertise upon which his entire career was built, something shifted in the room. The hunter had become the hunted. Dr. Hartwick's mouth opened, then closed. For perhaps the first time in his distinguished career, he found himself without words. The challenge Margaret had issued wasn't just academic, it was existential. Everything about his presence here tonight, his entire social value to this room full of wealthy patrons, rested on his mastery of subjects they would never fully understand. He was the interpreter, the authority, the guardian of knowledge too complex for ordinary comprehension, and now a 16-year-old girl in a server's uniform was asking him to prove it. This is ridiculous, he finally said, switching back to English, his voice carrying a forced laugh. I'm not going to engage in some circus performance to satisfy a cur times, Margaret interrupted. Why are you afraid? The question, delivered in flawless Latin with the proper inflection, cut through the room like a blade. Several guests gasped audibly. Even those who didn't understand the language could hear the challenge in Margaret's tone, could see the way Dr. Hartwick's face drained of color. I am not afraid, he snapped, his composure cracking visibly. I simply find this entire spectacle beneath the dignity of serious scholarship. You've memorized some passages, learned some grammar rules from books you had no business touching in the first place. Non est timidus, Margaret pressed, taking a step forward. You're not scared? Tanc conare. Si vere Latine loqueris, si vere linguam Romanorum posside sicut dicis, esto facilis tibi demonstrare. Then try. If you truly speak Latin, if you truly possess the language of the Romans, as you claim, it should be easy for you to demonstrate. Her Latin was fluid, natural, with the kind of casual confidence that came from genuine familiarity rather than classroom drilling. She used the subjunctive mood correctly, employed proper word order for emphasis, even captured the rhetorical patterns that Romans would have recognized. Dr. Hartwick took a step backward, and that single movement told everyone in the room everything they needed to know. His eyes darted to Mrs. Whitmore, then to the other guests, searching for some social mechanism that would restore order and remove him from this impossible situation. Eleanor, I must protest, he said, his voice rising. Your staff has disrupted what was meant to be a collegial evening of intellectual discourse. I came here as a guest, as a speaker, not to be harassed by someone who clearly doesn't understand the boundaries of... Boundaries? The word came from an unexpected source. Mr. Thomas Caldwell, a retired federal judge known for his sharp mind and sharper tongue, leaned forward in his chair. Dr. Hartwick, the young lady asked you a straightforward question. You've spent the last hour telling us about the importance of Latin, about how it separates the truly educated from the masses. She's offering you the opportunity to demonstrate that expertise. Why the reluctance? Other guests began to murmur agreement. What had started as a shocking breach of social protocol had transformed into something else entirely, a drama they were now invested in seeing through to its conclusion. The wealthy and powerful hadn't gathered here tonight to watch a predictable lecture. They'd wanted to be entertained, stimulated, given something worth discussing at their next dinner party. Margaret had delivered that in spades. Dr. Hartwick's eyes flashed with anger, but he was trapped. To refuse now would be to admit defeat, to confirm the very thing Margaret's challenge implied, that his expertise was more performance than substance, more social positioning than genuine mastery. "Fine," he said through clenched teeth. He drew himself up to his full height, attempting to reclaim the authority that had been slipping away since Margaret raised her hand. When he spoke, it was in Latin, but the words came slowly, carefully constructed. Puella es audax, sed audacia non est sapientia. Girl, you are bold, but boldness is not wisdom. The Latin was grammatically correct but stilted, the kind of simple sentence construction that a strong undergraduate might produce. There was no fluidity, no natural rhythm, none of the ease that should come from genuine immersion in the language. Margaret responded immediately, her Latin flowing like water. Verum dicis, audacia non est sapientiam, sed non sapientia nos docet quaerere veritatem, etiam quando veritas nos incommodos facit. Tu hac nocte multa de Romanis dixisti, deorum virtutibus, deorum potentia, sed Romani ipsi cognoscebant hanc veritatem, virtus non in verbis habitat, sed in factis. You speak truly. Boldness is not wisdom. But doesn't wisdom teach us to seek truth even when truth makes us uncomfortable? You spoke much tonight about the Romans, about their virtues, about their power. But the Romans themselves knew this truth. Virtue doesn't dwell in words, but in deeds. She used complex subordinate clauses, proper sequence of tenses, even threw in a rhetorical question that Cicero himself might have employed. The difference in fluency was stark, undeniable, devastating. Dr. Hartwick's response came even more slowly, his forehead now visibly beaded with perspiration. "No, non debeo me defendere, contra servum." I should not have to defend myself against a servant. The final word, servum, landed like a slap. Several guests recoiled. Mrs. Whitmore closed her eyes, her worst fears about the evening's trajectory confirmed. Even those sympathetic to Dr. Hartwick's position recognized that he'd just made a terrible miscalculation, allowing his frustration to strip away the veneer of scholarly objectivity and reveal something uglier beneath. Margaret stood very still for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was quiet but clear, and she switched back to English so that everyone would understand every word. "I'm a server, yes. My mother cleans your bathrooms and makes your beds. We live in a 2-bedroom apartment in Dorchester that costs more than we can afford, and I go to a public school where half the textbooks are missing pages. I learned Latin from books I borrowed from this library, studying after my shifts ended, using a flashlight because our apartment's electricity gets shut off sometimes when we can't make the payment." She paused, letting the reality of her words settle over the room's Persian rugs and oil paintings and people who'd never worried about electricity bills. "But here's what I've learned from 3 years of studying the language. You claim to have mastered. The Romans had a phrase, veritas vos liberabit. The truth will set you free. And the truth tonight is that you can't speak the language you've built your career on. You can read it probably, translate prepared texts with a dictionary and enough time. But speak it, think in it, use it the way the Romans actually used it. You can't, and that's fine. Most Latin scholars can't. It's a dead language after all." She took a breath, her eyes never leaving Dr. Hartwick's face. "But you spent this evening telling everyone here that Latin fluency was the mark of true intellect, that it separated the educated elite from the common masses who lacked the capacity for such rigor. You used it to make yourself seem superior, to justify why some people deserve access to knowledge and others don't. And when someone from those masses proved they could do what you claimed only the elite could do, you didn't congratulate them for their dedication or curiosity. You insulted them for daring to cross a line you'd drawn. The silence that followed was different from any that had come before. It was the silence of people being forced to confront something they'd previously been able to ignore. The arbitrariness of the boundaries they'd accepted, the possibility that talent and intelligence might exist in places they'd never thought to look. Judge Caldwell was the first to move. He stood slowly from his chair and began to clap, a slow, deliberate applause that echoed through the salon. One by one, other guests joined him. Not all of them. Mrs. Patricia Ashford sat frozen in her seat, her face unreadable, but enough that the applause built into something real, something that acknowledged what they'd just witnessed. Dr. Hartwick stood alone before the fireplace, his face now crimson, his carefully constructed authority shattered beyond repair. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the salon doors, his footsteps loud against the hardwood floors. He paused at the threshold, seemed about to say something, then thought better of it. The doors closed behind him with a soft click that somehow felt final. Margaret realized she was shaking. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation was draining away, leaving her acutely aware of what she'd just done. The enormous bridge she'd just burned. Mrs. Whitmore would certainly fire her mother. They'd lose their income, possibly their apartment. The price of speaking truth to power, it turned out, was more than just words. But as she looked at the faces still watching her, some approving, some shocked, some calculating what this unexpected drama might mean for their own social narratives, she realized something else had happened too. She'd been seen. Not as furniture, not as help, not as part of the background machinery that kept wealthy lives running smoothly, but as a person with a mind, with knowledge, with something valuable to contribute. And once you've been truly seen, Margaret thought, it's impossible to go back to being invisible, even if everything else fell apart. That moment of visibility had been worth it. The applause faded into an uncomfortable silence as Dr. Hartwick's departure left a vacuum in the salon. Margaret stood frozen, suddenly hyper-aware that she was still in her server's uniform, still technically working, still fundamentally out of place in this gathering, regardless of what had just transpired. The momentary triumph began to curdle into something that felt dangerously close to panic. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore rose from her seat with the careful precision of someone exercising enormous self-control. Her face had gone from flushed embarrassment to a pale, tight-lipped fury that Margaret recognized from the few times she'd witnessed other staff members being terminated. Eleanor crossed the salon floor with measured steps, her silk dress whispering against the antique furniture. When she reached Margaret, she leaned in close enough that only Margaret could hear her words, delivered in a whisper sharp as broken glass. "Kitchen, now! Don't say another word!" Margaret's legs felt unsteady as she walked toward the servant's door at the back of the salon, acutely conscious of every eye tracking her exit. The whispered conversations erupted the moment the door swung closed behind her, cutting off the view of that glittering world she'd just disrupted so catastrophically. The kitchen was chaos. Rosa Chen stood at the central island, her hands moving mechanically through the process of arranging dessert plates. But her face was stricken. She'd heard everything. The walls between the kitchen and salon were thick but not soundproof, and the other staff members who'd been circulating with drinks had returned with wide eyes and urgent whispers, piecing together what had happened. "Margaret," Rosa breathed, setting down the serving spoon with trembling hands. "What did you do?" Before Margaret could answer, Mrs. Whitmore swept into the kitchen, bringing with her the cold authority of old money and social position. The other staff members immediately found pressing tasks at the far end of the room. creating the illusion of privacy while remaining close enough to hear every word. 12 years, Eleanor said, her voice vibrating with controlled rage. 12 years your mother has worked for my family, Rosa. 12 years of loyalty, of trust, of what I believed was mutual respect. And this is how you repay that? Rosa's face crumpled. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm so sorry. I don't know what, Margaret, she would never normally. She humiliated a guest in my home. Eleanor cut her off. A distinguished scholar, a man I personally invited to speak before some of the most influential people in Boston. Do you understand what you've done? Dr. Hartwick will tell everyone he knows about this incident. My reputation, my standing, the fundraiser I was planning for the museum. All of it compromised because your daughter decided to play intellectual games with someone so far above her station that, above her station, the voice came from the kitchen doorway. Judge Caldwell stood there, his considerable frame filling the entrance, his expression unreadable. He must have followed them from the salon, though no one had noticed. Eleanor turned, surprise flickering across her face before she recovered her composure. Thomas, this is a staff matter. I appreciate your concern, but above her station, he repeated, stepping fully into the kitchen. That's an interesting phrase, Eleanor. I haven't heard it used quite so explicitly in years, though we all dance around it constantly, don't we? Who belongs where? Who deserves what? Who has the right to speak, and who should remain silent? He walked over to where Margaret stood beside her mother, his shrewd eyes studying her with an intensity that made her want to shrink back into invisibility. What's your full name, young lady? Margaret Chen, sir, she managed. Margaret Chen, he repeated slowly, as if tasting the syllables. And where do you go to school? Boston Latin Academy, sir. I'm a junior. His eyebrows rose slightly. Boston Latin Academy was a public exam school, one of the oldest and most prestigious in the country, but admission was based purely on test scores rather than family connections or tuition payments. Your grades? Margaret hesitated, glancing at her mother. Rosa nodded almost imperceptibly. I have a 4.0 GPA, sir. I'm taking AP courses in literature, history, and calculus. And you taught yourself Latin. Why? The question caught her off guard. No one had ever asked her why, as if the answer was self-evident or irrelevant. I wanted to understand where words came from. English is full of Latin roots, and I kept encountering phrases in books, legal terms, scientific names, historical documents. It felt like there was this whole layer of meaning I was missing. So I started with a beginner's grammar book from the library here, and then she trailed off, aware of how inadequate the explanation sounded. And then you couldn't stop, Judge Caldwell finished for her. Because once you glimpse how much knowledge is out there, how much beauty and complexity exists in human achievement, you can't close that door again. Even when everyone around you suggests you should be satisfied with less. He turned back to Eleanor, and his expression had hardened. I've known you for 20 years, Eleanor. I've served on boards with you, attended your events, respected your family's contributions to this city. But what I witnessed tonight was extraordinary, and not in the way you seem to think. Thomas, you cannot possibly— That girl, he pointed at Margaret, displayed more genuine scholarship, more authentic engagement with classical learning than Hartwick has shown in any of the 3 lectures I've had the misfortune of sitting through. And yes, I said misfortune, because Jonathan Hartwick is a mediocre academic who's built a career on social connections and the kind of credentialism that mistakes pedigree for intelligence. Eleanor's mouth opened in shock. Around the kitchen, the staff had abandoned all pretense of working, standing motionless as they absorbed this confrontation between 2 titans of Boston society. He couldn't converse in Latin because he never learned to think in it, Judge Caldwell continued. He learned to translate it, to analyze it as a dead thing, to use it as a marker of social distinction. But your daughter's employee? She learned it because she loved it. She absorbed it the way the Romans themselves would have, through reading, practice, genuine passion. That's not playing games, Eleanor. That's scholarship in its purest form. That doesn't excuse her behavior, Eleanor said, but her voice had lost some of its certainty. She interrupted a speaker, challenged a guest, made a spectacle. He challenged the room, Margaret said quietly. Everyone turned to look at her. She'd found her voice again, and with it a clarity about what had actually happened. Dr. Hartwick asked who could speak Latin. He issued a challenge, and I answered it. I didn't interrupt. I responded to a direct question. "You're a server," Eleanor said, but the words came out more uncertain than authoritative. "Tonight I was," Margaret agreed. "But that doesn't change whether I know Latin or not. Knowledge doesn't respect job titles, Mrs. Whitmore. Either you can conjugate verbs and pass syntax, or you can't. Either you've put in the hours to master something difficult, or you haven't. My uniform doesn't make Latin words mean something different." Judge Caldwell made a sound that might have been a laugh or a cough. "Exactly so." He pulled out his phone, typed something quickly, then looked back at Margaret. "I'm a trustee at Boston Latin Academy. I'm also on the scholarship committee at several universities. What are your plans after graduation, Margaret?" The question felt absurd given the circumstances. She was probably about to be fired, or at least her mother was, which amounted to the same thing. I haven't really thought that far ahead, sir. College is expensive, and expensive, yes. Impossible, no." He finished typing and pocketed his phone. "My assistant will be in touch with you early next week. I'd like to discuss some opportunities. There are programs, scholarships, paths forward for students with your kind of demonstrated ability and self-motivation." He paused, then added pointedly, "regardless of their station." Eleanor Whitmore stood very still, and Margaret could almost see the calculations running behind her eyes. Thomas Caldwell wasn't just any guest. He was a federal judge, a Harvard Law School graduate, someone whose social capital exceeded even her own family's considerable standing. If he chose to make Margaret's cause his own, to frame tonight's incident as a triumph rather than a scandal, the narrative could shift entirely. More importantly, other guests had followed the judge to the kitchen. They clustered in the doorway now, not all of them, but enough. People with their phones out, clearly having searched for something. Mrs. Rebecca Martinez, a professor at MIT, stepped forward. "Mrs. Whitmore, I just looked up the Latin texts this young woman referenced. Her translations were accurate, not just accurate, but nuanced. She caught subtleties that even good students miss." Rebecca looked at Margaret with something like wonder, and her spoken Latin was remarkable. "I minored in classics at Yale, and I couldn't maintain a conversation the way she did." Another voice joined in, David Park, a tech entrepreneur who'd made billions in software. "I built my company on the idea that talent exists everywhere, but opportunity doesn't. We're always looking for proof that traditional gatekeeping fails to identify genuine ability. Tonight, we all just watched that proof happen in real time." The kitchen had become crowded now, the boundaries between the servant's domain and the guest's world dissolving in a way that would have been unthinkable an hour ago. Margaret found herself at the center of attention again, but this time the quality of that attention had changed. These people weren't looking at her as a curiosity or an oddity. They were looking at her as someone who'd forced them to question assumptions they'd held without examination. Mrs. Whitmore's shoulders dropped slightly, the fight draining out of her as she recognized that the evening had moved beyond her control. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, almost defeated. "Rosa, you and Margaret should go home. We'll discuss this further when cooler heads prevail." It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't immediate termination either. Rosa grabbed Margaret's arm, clearly wanting to escape before the situation could shift again. But as they moved toward the staff exit, Judge Caldwell called out, "Margaret, one more thing. What you did tonight took courage, the kind that most adults spend their whole lives avoiding. Don't apologize for it. Don't shrink from it. The world needs people who speak the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. Especially when it's uncomfortable." Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice, and let her mother pull her toward the exit. As the door closed behind them, cutting off the view of the kitchen and the guests and the life she'd just upended, She heard the conversations resume, animated, excited, full of energy that hadn't been there at the start of the evening. She'd wanted to be invisible. Instead, she'd become unforgettable. And somewhere in the cold October night, as she and her mother walked to the bus stop in silence, Margaret realized that everything was about to change. The bus ride home felt surreal. Margaret and Rosa sat in silence, the fluorescent lights overhead casting harsh shadows across their faces as the vehicle lurched through Boston's streets. Other passengers, night shift workers, students coming home late from the library, people whose lives existed in the margins of the city's wealth, paid them no attention. They were invisible again. Just two more tired women in work clothes heading back to neighborhoods the tourists never visited. Rosa didn't speak until they'd climbed the 3 flights of stairs to their apartment, the hallway's flickering bulb doing little to dispel the darkness. Only when the door closed behind them, sealing them into their small sanctuary of thrift store furniture and patched walls, did her mother finally break. "What were you thinking?" Rosa's voice cracked, tears streaming down her face as weeks of exhaustion and fear finally found their outlet. "Do you know what you've risked? What you've thrown away? I've worked 12 years, Margaret. 12 years of scrubbing their toilets and biting my tongue and saying, 'Yes, Mom,' and of course, sir, so that we could have this apartment, so that you could go to a good school, so that we could survive in this city that costs everything and gives us nothing." Margaret felt her own tears coming, hot and shameful. "Mom, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. You didn't mean to embarrass a Harvard professor in front of Boston's richest people. You didn't mean to make Mrs. Whitmore look like she can't control her own staff. You didn't mean to destroy the only stable income we have." Rosa sank onto their worn couch, her face in her hands. "I came to this country with nothing. I cleaned houses so you could have opportunities I never had. And you just threw it all away for what? To prove you're smart. We already know you're smart, baby. But being smart doesn't pay rent." The words hit harder than anger would have. Margaret sat beside her mother, the weight of what she'd done finally crushing down on her. In the moment, standing up to Dr. Hartwick had felt righteous, necessary, true. But here in their apartment, with its second-hand everything and the constant worry about money lurking in every corner, the consequences felt overwhelmingly real. "I couldn't stay quiet," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was saying that people like us don't deserve knowledge, that we're not capable of it, that education should only belong to people who already have everything." And everyone was nodding along like that was just obvious truth instead of cruelty. Rosa looked up at her daughter, and something in her expression shifted, anger giving way to a deeper, more complicated emotion. "I know," she said softly. "I heard what he said, and part of me was proud of you for standing up. But Margaret, pride doesn't feed us. Pride doesn't keep the lights on." They sat together in the dark apartment, the silence broken only by the sounds of the city outside, sirens in the distance, someone's television too loud through thin walls, the endless urban symphony of lives pressed too close together. Margaret's phone buzzed. Then again, and again. She pulled it from her pocket and stared at the screen in disbelief. 15 missed calls, 27 text messages, emails flooding in faster than her old phone could load them. "Mom," she said slowly, her voice strange even to her own ears, "I think you need to see this." The first message was from a number she didn't recognize. "This is David Park. Judge Caldwell shared your contact. I fund scholarships for exceptional students. We need to talk. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. at my office." Another from a Boston Globe reporter, working on a story about tonight's events at the Whitmore estate. "Would love to interview you about your Latin studies and educational journey." An email from the Dean of Admissions at Boston University, Ms. Chen. "We were made aware of your remarkable demonstration of classical scholarship this evening. Our classics department would like to invite you to campus to discuss early admission opportunities and our full scholarship program." Message after message, each one more surreal than the last. Scholarship offers, interview requests, invitations to speak at schools and community centers. Someone had filmed part of the confrontation, not the whole thing, but enough, and it was already spreading across social media with captions like, "Maid's daughter destroys elitist professor," and "This is what genius looks like." Rosa read over Margaret's shoulder, her expressions cycling through disbelief, hope, fear, and something that might have been wonder. "I don't understand," she breathed. "What is happening?" What was happening, Margaret slowly realized, was that the story had escaped the confines of the Whitmore salon. In an age where video clips and social media could turn moments into movements overnight, her confrontation with Dr. Hartwick had become something larger than itself. It had touched a nerve, the anger of everyone who'd been told they didn't belong, couldn't achieve, should know their place. The resentment toward gatekeepers who used education as a weapon rather than a gift. The hunger for stories where the underdog didn't just survive, but triumphed on merit alone. By midnight, the video had over 1 million views. By morning, it would be 10 million. Margaret Chen, teenage server from Dorchester, had accidentally become the face of a conversation about class, access, and who gets to claim knowledge as their birthright. The knock on their door at 7 in the morning made them both jump. Rosa peered through the peephole, then gasped. Judge Caldwell stood in their hallway, looking strangely out of place in his expensive suit against the backdrop of their building's cracked walls and peeling paint. "May I come in?" he asked when Rosa opened the door, his tone respectful rather than presumptuous. "I wanted to speak with you both before the day gets away from us." He sat in their small living room, refusing Rosa's flustered offers of coffee or tea, and got straight to the point. "What happened last night has attracted attention, more than I expected, frankly. You're going to be flooded with opportunities over the next few weeks, some genuine and some exploitative. You'll need guidance navigating them." He pulled out a folder thick with documents. "I've spent the morning making calls. I've secured a meeting with the scholarship committee at Harvard, yes, Harvard, for next week. Boston College and MIT have also reached out. Beyond university admissions, there are 3 different foundations interested in funding your education completely, including living expenses. One is willing to provide housing assistance for your mother as well." Rosa made a small sound, her hand over her mouth. Margaret felt dizzy, unable to process what she was hearing. "But here's what you need to understand," Judge Caldwell continued, his expression serious. "This attention is both an opportunity and a burden. People will want to make you a symbol of meritocracy, of the American dream, of whatever narrative serves their purposes. Some will put you on a pedestal. Others will try to tear you down, claim you're an exception that proves nothing about systemic barriers. You'll be scrutinized, criticized, held to impossible standards." He leaned forward, his eyes locked on Margaret's. "The question is, what do you want? Not what others want for you or from you. What do you actually want from your life?" Margaret thought about the books that had saved her, poetry that made her feel less alone, history that showed her how humans had always struggled and survived, languages that opened windows into different ways of seeing the world. She thought about the other kids at her school who were just as smart, just as hungry for knowledge, but who'd never get the chance she was being offered now because they didn't have a viral video or a judge in their corner. "I want to learn," she said finally. "Everything. History, literature, languages, philosophy, all of it. But I want other people like me to have the same chance. Kids who have to study by flashlight because the electricity's shut off. Kids whose guidance counselors tell them to be realistic instead of ambitious. I want to prove that we're not exceptions or anomalies. We're everywhere if anyone bothered to look." Judge Caldwell smiled, a real smile, warm and genuine. "Then we'll make sure you get that chance. And we'll make sure you're not alone in it." He stood, preparing to leave, then paused at the door. "By the way, Dr. Hartwick resigned from his position at Harvard this morning. The video made it clear he couldn't do what he claimed expertise in. The academic world is less forgiving of exposed frauds than you might think." He shook his head. "Pride and gatekeeping, they make people brittle. When you build your authority on exclusion rather than genuine mastery, it only takes one brave person to bring the whole structure down. After he left, Margaret and Rosa sat together in their small apartment as morning light filtered through curtains that didn't quite close all the way. The future that had seemed so impossibly narrow just yesterday had suddenly blown wide open, full of possibilities that terrified and thrilled in equal measure. "Mom," Margaret said quietly, "I'm sorry I risked everything, but I'm not sorry I spoke." Rosa pulled her daughter close, and when she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "I came to this country because I believed that here, maybe, my child could be seen for who she really is, instead of where she came from. Last night you made yourself impossible to ignore. You were brave in ways I've never been brave. I'm not angry, baby. I'm proud. So proud." 3 months later, Margaret Chen would walk through the gates of Harvard University on a full scholarship, the first person in her family to attend college. She would major in classics and education, determined to bridge the worlds she'd inhabited. She would start a non-profit providing free online Latin instruction and tutoring for low-income students. She would give talks at schools and community centers about access to knowledge and the importance of speaking up even when your voice shakes. But that October night, sitting with her mother in their small apartment as the sun rose over Boston, she was just a 16-year-old girl who dared to raise her hand when someone asked a question, who'd refused to stay invisible even when invisibility was safer, who'd learned that sometimes the most radical act is simply to demonstrate that you exist, that you're capable, that the barriers others have built are only as solid as everyone agrees to pretend they are. The room had gone silent when she raised her hand. But the conversation that followed about class, education, merit, and who deserves opportunity was just beginning. And this time, people like Margaret would have a voice in it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.